Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Conversation Africa's Dialogue, Country Platforms and Development Finance in a Post-Aid World, Why Africa Needs It. My name is Candice Bailey, and it's really wonderful that you are able to join us for what is the third virtual event in the Conversations virtual event series for 2025. This event is a partnership with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and we're really grateful for the team at the CSIL for joining us today. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before I hand over to the facilitator for the day, Kanye Mlambo. The first is that today's event is being recorded, and if you know somebody who is missing the discussion but would like to know more about it, please direct them to the Conversation Africa's playlist on YouTube, where in the next few days, where they can find the full event and watch it and be part of the conversation after the fact. Also, if you are sharing the event on your social media platforms, which we hope you do, please use the hashtags TCA Dialogues and hashtag Country Platforms to share the event with those around you. And the last is that you will be able to ask some questions as part of the discussion. So please drop your questions into the Q&A box, and we will then be able to use them at the time that the Q&A opens. Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy your event. For now, I want to hand over to Kanye Mlambo, who is a fellow at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Kanye, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Candice. Thank you so much for the introduction. And again, thank you for the partnership between ourselves and you, Conversation Africa.
Perfect. I'm handing over to you now. Good luck for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our discussion. I just want all our panelists to please switch on your video so that we can see that this is not AI. We do actually have human beings with the voices, and they are real and they are live. So welcome to all our panelists, and also a big welcome to everybody who's joining us, particularly across our continent and also beyond where we are sitting in Africa. A big shout out, by the way, to all our CISL alumni. We are really excited that you have joined us this morning. You know, as I often say, the story of our continent could never be the story of we don't have. It's not a story of lack. It has always been a story of potential, of alignment, and waiting for that opportunity to find ourselves again. And today's conversation speaks directly to that alignment, to that means what does it mean to be Africa, and to be an African in Africa with everything that we are faced with. So we are here to reflect on a powerful and timely idea: country platforms and development finance in a post-aid era, particularly here. Why does Africa need it? We've seen, ladies and gentlemen, that throughout our being as a continent, it has always been we're waiting for somebody to do something for us. And we've seen how some of our friends have decided to pull the carpet under our feet. And here we are, country platforms. Why we need it, particularly at a time like this. And I'm going to introduce my colleague and my panelists later, who are going to help us to understand why country platforms are a potential, possibly a powerful tool going forward for governments, for our developmental partners, for private investors to come together behind a single national vision across the continent. How do we grow our own story based on our own understanding and what it is that we have? You know, we always talk about it is about time that Africa provides the solutions with an African understanding for what we know is going to stand the test of time. So we're going to unpack more of these. I'd like to introduce my friend, my brother, my colleague who has authored actually our latest report at CISL, Stefan Robbenheimer, who is a fellow at our Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. He is a guy who is a climate and development finance qualified lawyer, mediator, arbitrator, and process facilitator. Stefan's career started in 1983 with the attorney's profession, and he set up the South North, which helped us to be where we are today in terms of looking at the African Climate Foundation. And also, he has been part and parcel of the board. Steph, how are you?
I'm very well. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, we can see you, and I'm so happy that you've combed your hair. You look great. Welcome.
This is a rare thing.
This is an opportunity for you just to give us your thoughts. You've also authored quite a lot of papers. You've been on many platforms as far as country platforms is concerned. And I'm just going to give you an opportunity just to take us through your thoughts this afternoon. Welcome.
Tanya, thank you very, very much. It's such a delight working with you and with Olamide and Deepak, and of course Richard, all of whom I know well, and we've shared thoughts on this issue before. So thank you very, very much. This is not a new subject. It's an issue that's been around for quite a while. But I think today we'll focus on how meaningful it is for Africa in the African context, and why it is possibly quite an important issue for consideration across the African countries. I'll start with some fun facts, okay? And they're just fun money facts. In the world today, there are savings, mostly focused in the global north, and 60% in the United States of America. Those are the savings of $58 million millionaires, and they amount to an astonishing $515 trillion. Of that $515 trillion, there's about $130 trillion that is liquid institutional capital, which you could say is looking for a home. It's looking for a place to invest. At the moment, it's restricted to the bond market and to the northern stock exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange, which we know is dominated by 7 AI companies.
Mm.
So that's a full value of $6-7 trillion. So there's a lot of extra cash in the world at the moment looking for better places to go. Correspondingly, there's a decrease of aid money and of concessional capital in the form of low interest loans and low return capital, equity capital.
Mm.
Of that money, Africa receives around 3%, despite having a much larger global population than that justifies. We should be getting 10% and beyond, but we're not. We're not seen yet as a useful destination for those global savings, or at least not at the scale that we need. So that's just something from the supply side. From the demand side, we can quantify the development gap in Africa in the trillions of dollars.
Mm.
You know, a country like Kenya only has, I think, 5 megawatts of installed electricity. All of it is low carbon, so it's not a carbon problem. But it's got the same population as South Africa, more or less, which has more than 40 megawatts installed.
Mm.
So you see these huge development gaps in African countries, which become quite enormous in the really poor countries like, for example, Madagascar, where we've just seen political upheaval. So the need is massive in Africa, and the opportunity is massive in Africa, especially because it's the only continent with young people in the world. So we're doing something wrong, and we need to change behavior across the continent and improve the magnetic ability of the continent to receive investment funds and investment partnerships. However, in the past, when that relationship has occurred in countries in Africa that are rich in resources, it's mainly been extractive, okay? So the agenda is mainly built by the investors who say, all right, well, I can get something out of Ghana, or I can get something out of Zambia, and I can make a decent return, okay? And what remains behind in terms of development dividends to the country remains far less than should be the case, okay? And so this is a crisis of partnership, okay, and a crisis of leadership in partnership. And as we exited from the post-colonial phase, this crisis continued. In terms of climate, Professor Carlos Lopez, one of our colleagues, says that Africa always argues Africa, many countries in Africa, of course, but there's a common argument called the legacy argument, which is, we didn't cause this problem, we are hurt by it, please help us, or you owe us, okay? But we know that climate finance, as it's so called, is very small compared to the need. It's contestable, these numbers, but the need for the climate and development requirement of Africa will probably be $1 trillion more per year. Now, it's not that the money isn't there, as you can see. There's lots of it there. It's that we can't catch it. One of the ways that is emerging in Africa, and a few countries are leaders in that respect, is that we create country investment platforms. And these are platforms that primarily attract investment, secondarily attract investment that has a climate and biodiversity component, which is probably most investment these days. I mean, if you think of energy, electric vehicles, hydrogen, effective agriculture, water management, everything now is climate orientated to some degree. And a platform that is managed by the whole country. It's not managed by one minister or one corporation. It is a whole of economy driven leadership institution, or that's why it's called a platform. It can be anything that engages with partners who hold these global savings in order to attract and bring more savings to this country. I was fascinated by the leadership dimensions of this partner management, and we're still exploring what those are. Yeah. But some countries have already done this, and Deepak is very experienced. He has been involved in the South African platform, which has been the oldest one of this kind in the world, although there have been other non-climate investment platforms before in various parts of the world. But we see also the adoption of this approach by Egypt, which has a water, food, energy combination platform, by Senegal, which has an energy platform, and of course by South Africa, an energy platform. And even a small country like Lesotho now has a platform, which is an export of renewable energy to Johannesburg largely. And we see other African countries like Zambia, Tanzania, Malawi, and many others, at least 10 others, showing an intense interest. And we wanted to, together with you, Kanye, explore whether this format would be useful for Africa. It's complex. I was engaged with the Minister of Development Planning in Colombia 2 days ago. They are launching their platform in Brazil at COP30 in 3 weeks' time. And it's an extremely sophisticated investment design, okay? And inspired me by its cleverness and thoughtfulness. It's got 5 elements to it. Those are ecotourism, biodiversity economy, energy, ecosystem like forest restoration, and climate change mitigation. So the examples are starting to pop up all over. Useful and very important for African countries to reflect together. Where can this work for us? Why is it important for us? And what can we do with this emerging mechanism? I hand back to you, Kanye.
Thank you. Critical questions. Why is it important? Do we have the power, the space, the infrastructure, the mechanism, the understanding as Africa to actually take the advantage and see opportunities? You mentioned, for me, powerfully, young people. We are a young continent. And long after a whole lot of us sitting here will be gone, what are we going to leave behind, and what is the role of country platforms? Candice, I'm not sure if we have any questions for Steph, and whether we have any comments on the chat, because I can't see that at the moment, before I go on to our panel. But Steph, thank you so much for sharing that. You mentioned, on the supply side of finance, we can only access only 3% as a continent. And then when you look at what's going to be needed going forward, you mentioned over 3 trillion, and you mentioned that it's not that there is no money, it's just about how to access. And maybe that question back to you, just maybe unpack it a little bit more for us on the why such legal, and also how you see that opportunity for us to be able to look at that 3 trillion on our own.
Well, perhaps, and I'll be very interested to hear what Olamide and Deepak have to say about this, but to take this generally, okay, and generalizations are a little bit dangerous. But in order to attract investment, I'd say one of the leadership qualities that interested me was discipline. It requires a tremendous discipline to achieve a cross-ministerial consensus about what we want to do, and to achieve a realism about what it's going to cost, and an attraction about what returns it's going to give, both for the investors and for our country. Okay. This discipline, you can't wing it. You've got to do very advanced fiscal analysis and data analysis about things that are highly complex. You've got to do climate science projections into the future to see which sectors are resilient and which are not, and what the cost would be if you didn't spend resilience funds now. So this disciplining element is also visible to the investors. The more discipline they see, the more they trust that the risk factors in that country, are receding.
Right.
So this is the one thing. The other thing is that there's some courage involved. And we saw, for example, in South Africa, that courage was needed by our leadership to push through a package that was very future orientated, in which some incumbents in the current economy would lose out in the long run. Okay, it takes courage to risk that for an agricultural sector. I now need to invest $100 billion in water management for something that I want to avoid in 10, 15 years' time. Okay. So there's a kind of courage element. There's a writer, an economist called Stefan Durkheim, who talks about development bargains. It's almost like the society has to get together and make its bargain, and then discipline its internal structures to be so orientated towards achieving that bargain and implementing it. Okay. Also, you can't just plan. You've got to take the money in and put it on the ground and show afterwards that it's working. So I keep on liking the term discipline, because it is really, for me, what a country platform centrally is at the demand side.
Okay. Steph, thank you so much for that. And I think you've just laid the foundation for us to have our panel involved. And hopefully they will help us to understand how the landscape is changing, and also to answer to some of the questions that we may have. And it's my pleasure to introduce my panelists, starting with Mr. Deepak Patel. Deepak is the head of Climate Finance and Innovation at South African Presidential Climate Commission, which is linked to JETP. And he joined this commission, the PCC commission, in June 2021 as the head. He leads the team in its work in areas of climate finance mapping, financing, also very importantly, just transition, and developing strategy for financing the pathway to a net zero emission target for 2050, that big target. Prior to joining PCC, Deepak was a special advisor to the Minister of Public Enterprises from 2018 to 2020. So this is a gentleman who works directly with the president, because PCC reports directly to our South African president. The next panelist is Dr. Olamide Ambibola. Thank you for joining us. I know you're battling with the jet lag at the moment. You had to travel. Dr. Ambibola is a director, Africa Policy Research Institute, APIR. He's a founder and director of APIR. He focuses on economic informality, trade policy, regional integration, and nature resources management. And he has either conducted research or worked in Tunisia, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, and Nigeria, in many other countries as well. So we're very pleased to have you, Dr. Ambibola. And our next panelist is Professor Richard Canland, who is our director in Africa for CISL. He's also director and board leadership program at the University of Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, Emeritus Associate Professor, Public Law, University of Cape Town, and also a visiting adjunct professor at Wits School of Governance. Richard is also an independent high-level expert group on climate finance. So these are gentlemen who are going to be helping us to understand even the country platforms better. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Olamide Ambibola. You have studied country platforms. You have studied how they emerge across the different African contexts. Stefan has mentioned some of them in some of the countries. What patterns are you seeing in terms of ownership and coordination? Again, Stefan spoke a lot about the sense of responsibility in how, as the continent, we could actually latch onto this.
Thank you very much, Kanyi, and thanks for not asking me to define country platforms because, because that's a thing that we've all been struggling with. However, Steph has laid out a few things that I can build on. But thanks to the Conversation on Africa and also Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, for having me on this panel. It's great to be speaking with Steph, Deepak, and Richard on the same panel. Like you've heard, I'm dealing with jet lag, so anything that I say that doesn't make sense, blame it on the jet lag. So back to the question that you asked, we have indeed been seeing country platforms emerge in Africa and beyond, right, as a way of coordinating probably the two biggest challenges that African countries are facing. One of them is the climate change and its effects and the responses to those effects on the one hand, and then the other is the need for economic transformation on the youngest continent in the world, as Steph mentioned, and on the continent where growth could actually be used quite a bit. So African countries, like I mentioned, need to address the climate change crisis, but they also have to transform their economies. And one thing that has emerged as a way of attracting the financing to help them on these two fronts is the country platform idea. So what are the patterns that we're seeing around ownership and coordination? First of all, for country platforms to exist, and I'm thinking of, so I kind of pack them as two. One is first generation country platforms like the JETPs, so the South African JETP, as well as the Senegalese JETP, and the others are things that we've seen emerging afterwards. For those to work, there are very clear things that need to exist. And one of them is that government has to be in the driving seat. It has to be very clear that this is a thing that is owned by the country, and one clear way of indicating that is that the government is in the driving seat of coming together and creating what it will be, of the implementation plan attached to it, of the drive to attract support from outsiders to actually make this happen. So one thing is that government has to be in the driver's seat. Second pattern that we are seeing is when creating country platforms, there has to be a clear alignment to the country's core priorities. Because if it is not aligned with the core priorities of the country, it's likely not to be something that would be clearly owned by the government. So in South Africa, the one priority was energy and the reliance on coal. But beyond that, there was also the need to support workers who may be affected by transition out of coal, the need to support communities that may be affected by the transition out of coal. That was part of the priorities of the government. And attached to that is also the idea that there are certain industries within South Africa that needed, that are attached to energy, but that would need support. One of them was hydrogen, and the country created a hydrogen roadmap, I think, at about the same time as the JETP was being designed, or at least that was being announced. There was also, the South Africa already has an automotive industry. How do you use something like the JETP to sort of support ambitions around that as well? So that's the second one. It has to be connected to the priorities of the country. A third one pattern that we're seeing is coordination. So if you had asked me about the definition of country platform, I would have kind of appealed to the coordinating effects of the country platform. Again, this is not something that is peculiar to Africa. We're seeing it across countries as well. I was chatting to someone from Indonesia a few months ago, earlier in the year, and the person said one of the key things that the JETP delivered to them was a coordination across government agencies, across government ministries, across government departments. Because in order for you to communicate with an external actor who might be able to support your plan, you actually need to create the plan. And you can't have plans that are floating and not connected to anything. You have to have a joint up plan, like Steph mentioned, something that requires a lot of discipline, right? A joined up approach from different ministries and different agencies. In the case of South Africa, it was sort of energy focused, but even for that, you needed to involve different actors across different ministries. The Senegalese one is also energy related, and that required a coordination across different agencies as well. The Egyptian one that was announced, I think it was also announced in 2022 actually, is a water energy food nexus. It's sort of looking at the three of them together. Just those three you can imagine the number of agencies that are involved in each one of them. Getting them all to come together under the auspices of the Ministry for Finance and Planning, creating what became their country platform was not an easy task. So the third element that we're seeing is coordination. And maybe the last one I would say is the anchoring it at the highest possible levels in government. If a country platform is not anchored within the top of the government, and we've seen this in the case of South Africa with presidency, like I mentioned earlier. In the case of Senegal, it's the same thing, and they were all created by political declarations by the presidency. In the case of Egypt as well, it was part of a clear political commitment from the government. If you don't see this, then one would begin to question just how serious it might be. So I think a country platform that is clearly anchored to the presidency or to that has clear blessings of the core mandate holder in a country is one that I would definitely pay attention to, and that I would be interested in seeing how it develops over time. But back to you, Kanye.
Thank you so much. With everything that's going wrong in South Africa, it's just so great to hear, Deepak, that these things that are going okay, like the country platform that's seen as pioneering, just as the doctor has just shared now. 4 critical things. It's about government's involvement in the leading seat, ensuring that there is coordination, the alignment, but anchored at the highest office in the country. And we see that's happening in South Africa. So what key lessons, Deepak, would you say other African countries can take from this? And is what we are seeing true? Because you are sitting right inside that seat next to the president.
Thank you, Kanye. And before we ring the bell on having succeeded and beaten the beast, let me say that every day is a challenge and we continue to learn. I do want to say that South Africa's JET-P, now the JET Investment and Implementation Plan, arose 3 years ago. And it's been 3 years of very difficult as well as hard work. It's also been 3 years of learning lessons. And I want to try to make fun of this concept of country platform in the following way. You asked, and Olumide declined to answer the question, what is a country platform? It's a very elusive animal, this thing. It reminds me of a story of a couple of blindfolded people being sent into the forest to discover the elephant. And they all got sent in, got rooted to the elephant, did what they needed to do, came back. And when the blindfolds were off, the group coordinator asked them, so describe this elephant. And the one who happened to touch the ears said, it actually felt like a large leaf. The one who hugged the leg said, no, you're wrong. It's a pillar. And the one who grabbed the tail said, no, you're all wrong. It's actually a vine. And all of them were correct, but none of them actually described the animal in its entirety. So if you want someone to describe what a country platform is, I want to suggest that we take the blindfolds off, firstly. But secondly, as we begin, especially in understanding country platforms, but then in being able to design them, learn from those who have gone before, and South Africa is amongst the first. Now, our country platform did not emerge as a country platform. What it emerged as was as a statement of intent, commitment, and goodwill between a global north, which had realized by COP21 that they had not made good to their global commitment to assisting developing countries to go through a climate-oriented transition. It came from us as a result of having analyzed through the PCC and then submitting at that time a realistic but nonetheless ambitious nationally determined contribution, which showed that the country was actually quite serious about embarking on an industrial and economic development journey that also at the same time would result in carbon emissions reductions. And it was this that brought, on the sidelines of the multilateral system, a bilateral agreement between a group of northern or developed countries and South Africa, and that got given impetus as a result of the President Ramaphosa himself signing what is now known as a political declaration for a JET partnership. JET, for those who don't know, is just energy transition, and Olumide has already indicated that in South Africa, energy is at the heart of our development challenge, both with respect to social access and affordability, but just as importantly, as it relates to economic security of energy. And so when these two things came together, we had, in essence, a baseline from which we could show commitment as a country, and we could show confidence that we had what it took to put all of the systems in place to be able to manage this transition as we had committed to doing. Now, to get a little more specific and practical, let me say that we did not want to be put in a position where we only committed ourselves to carbon reduction and to, in this case, either decommissioning or increasing the mix of renewable energy, but we also indicated that we needed a bigger vision with respect to energy security, access, and affordability. And therefore, understanding full well, again, as Olumide has pointed out, that we have a well-established automotive sector which was at risk of, in essence, being broken. We therefore put in new energy or electric vehicles as part of our package. We also saw that in the medium to long term, we had all of the natural endowments that were necessary to become a real producer of green hydrogen, which would give energy to some of our hard-to-abate sectors for domestic use, but also potentially then, as a result of our natural energy endowments, put us in a position where we could export. And so our package, while it was energy-focused, was not simply the decommissioning of power stations and the building out of renewables, but in fact, it was a package, while incorporating those aspects, also had a forward-looking view with respect to where was our development pathway. It has been a struggle. Firstly, the grant component of the 8.5 billion committed was not sufficient, and it was not coherent. Secondly, as we know, as a result of some happenings in a country across the Atlantic, one partner pulled out of it. In addition to that, however, other parties who had not been part of the original agreement, but want to create this compact of trust, goodwill, and working together joined. And so while there was 1 billion that got removed as a result of someone stepping out, it has in fact grown in commitment terms to around about 12 billion. However, it hasn't been easy to flow that money. And I think the big lessons to be learned here, especially for other countries and for us as we review on the back of our experience, what is it that needs to be done? Other countries need to also understand that we need to move away from a conventional project finance conception of the world and move into a much more programmatic form of planning that then allows that capital not only to flow as committed, but also to flow in a way that can be scaled up, leveraged to enable both the domestic and international private sectors to come into play in a variety of different ways. We can unpack, if we have time during the panel, what this means with respect to risk, what this means with respect to cost of capital, and what this means, especially as lessons we've learned, means for introducing elements of other parts of our climate response, namely resilience and adaptation and climate disaster response, because these are the elements that were missing from our platform. So our platform, while very important, is not complete. And I think South Africa faces the challenge of adding the other elements, as Brazil, Colombia, and Egypt, having hopefully learned from our experience, have done in their case. Thank you.
Yeah. Deepak, thank you so much. And thank you for just that sobering background in terms of, yes, it might seem that we are getting it right, but it's not easy. This is similar to running a marathon. And also what I'm getting is the leadership aspect is quite critical. And you speak confidently around how working together with the president in the country has actually seen us make gains, some strides as far as country platform is concerned. We are going to come back to that. And Richard, when I think of the work that you do, you lead at CISL, leadership is at the center of everything that we do. Therefore, governance is also quite critical. How some of these things that we do in this agenda of Africa being beyond the donor era, cap in hand, going out and asking for aid. What makes country platforms different from that past donor-driven frameworks?
Well, thank you. You mentioned marathons, and of course, it's perhaps a good metaphor or image given what happened on Sunday, where serious headwinds prevented 24,000 people from doing the insane thing of running 42.2 kilometers, something that you know too well is a big challenge, even though you've strolled through 350 of them in your lifetime. And Deepak recently completed the one in Berlin, I should add, successfully, and we should applaud him for that. Those headwinds are significant from all directions at the moment. So I think we're all searching for new forms of leadership on the one hand, and also searching for new governance mechanisms that can address these challenges and can cope with those headwinds. Now, the image that comes to mind is nowhere near as graphic or entertaining as the elephant, but the one I use, and I've used it in the paper that Dr. Olamide has commissioned from me for his series at APRI. And I begin by talking about, for those people who visited Cape Town and seen our iconic unfinished freeway, two ends of an unfinished freeway, which, as Cape Townians, we say was deliberate and funny. Of course, it was an engineering mess up. And it captures for me the failure of the demand and supply sides of climate finance to meet. And so what we need to achieve is a buckle that can bring these two ends of the freeway together, the demand and the supply side. And the reason why I'm relatively optimistic is partly because I'm always relatively optimistic, but secondly, because I think that at their best, country platforms offer a potentially disruptive institutional mechanism, something that can change the game. And that's what we're looking for. Because if I build briefly on what Steph said in his opening remarks, the big problem we face is that capital, despite being abundant, is not going where it's needed. That is the core point here. And as Lord Stern said in his seminal report 19 years ago, and we're approaching the 20-year anniversary of that report, climate change continues to be the greatest market failure of all time. And that market failure persists. That market failure persists because capital continues to not go where it's needed. So we need something that will change that game, or disrupt that game. As someone who sits in climate finance conversations, including the independent high-level so-called expert group on climate finance that you mentioned, Kenny, I'm a governance person, but sitting with those finance people, I've become, I must say, increasingly frustrated, having watched this debate and these discussions over 15 years, ever since Copenhagen and the infamous 100 billion by 2020 commitment. I've become increasingly frustrated by the failure of what I call the failure of platitudinous approaches to climate finance, de-risking private finance, blended finance solutions. These are the tropes of a failed system, a broken system, in fact. So the exam question is really whether a country platform can remedy these problems. And of course, then we run the risk that we ask too much of them and that we become kind of intoxicated by the promise and the fad, and we fail to drill down and nail down what is required. Now, the paper we commissioned from Steph really tries to get underneath the bonnet of the institutional challenges and the leadership that is going to be required to make country platforms effective. When you commission papers like this, I've learned from experience, one can sometimes be sorely disappointed by what comes. On other occasions, such as this one, what comes back from the author is even better than what you hoped for. And so I really commend this paper to everybody. It really is an excellent survey of the institutional governance and leadership landscape that we all need to now understand and navigate if we are to ensure that these country platforms deliver on their promise. And a last point, if I may, Kanya, I really liked, Steph, what you said about the discipline or potential discipline of country platforms. You spoke of that discipline in terms of the demand side, and I think that's perhaps the predominant point. But I think it's a discipline that can work on both sides if you get it right. Because what it needs to do is discipline the supply side of climate and transition finance to recognize that countries must determine their strategic agenda. I'm very pleased that people think of the JETP as a pioneer. We've learned many lessons. Watching it as a sort of insider-outside, I've written extensively about how I see the Presidential Climate Commission as a remarkable accomplishment, a governance success, at a time when, frankly, South Africa was struggling with governance after the 9 years of President Zuma. So I think it's a great achievement. It's brought legitimacy to the process. It's truly multi-stakeholder. It's been largely accountable and transparently so. And I think that's been invaluable for the process, and there's a great deal to learn from that, despite the other headwinds and challenges that Deepak has spoken to. The one I really like to look at, however, is Egypt. At one of those meetings of the high-level group ahead of Dubai COP 2 years ago, the Minister for International Development, Dr. Rania Al-Mashhad, came and spoke to the group. And she was enormously impressive in terms of the thoughtfulness with which Egypt had gone about constructing their country platform, the strategic clarity of thought and intent, which led to those three big strategic levers that they wanted to pull around food and agriculture, water and energy. And of course, it's easy for me to sit here and say that, and very complex to do it and to implement it. But that clarity of strategic intent, which led then to the buckle of their country platform, with three big DFIs coming to the party for each one of those three levers, I think is also a useful case study. And finally, we are, of course, now developing case studies. We're developing the art and the science and a community of practice. And we need to work together. So one of the things I hope we'll accomplish as a leadership institute is not only to run highly customized leadership programs on country platforms, design and delivery and leadership, but also to convene country platform leaders in different ways so that they can work together, share knowledge and learning, and build and strengthen that community of practice. Thank you, Kanya.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think what you've done together with your fellow panelists is just to paint a picture of why country platforms matter, why they are important, and using the examples that we have heard. But we also know that in many instances, the investor also has a voice. At the end of the day, we can be aligned. We can have a government that's progressive, like we've seen in the countries that we have mentioned. We can have all the great intentions about being disciplined and ensuring that we are able to deliver. But how do we create a space for that inclusive growth? How do you make sure that we take everybody along with us? So Deepak, just want to go back to you in terms of the balancing the national priorities, as Dr. Ambiola said earlier on, in terms of it's important that this is aligned to the national priorities, but at the same time, we've all seen, particularly in this agenda of progressing the continent differently outside the donor aid, the investor expectations. How do you balance the two?
Thank you, Candy. I'm going to say something controversial. I've always, while being previously head of and now strategic advisor at the Presidential Climate Commission for Climate Finance, I've always taken a view well, not always. I started out thinking that climate finance was a particularly special form of finance. But I quickly came to realize that climate finance is finance. And to the extent that that finance can be attracted at scale and therefore mobilized for effect, is the extent to which you can then ask and answer the question, do we have climate endowments, climate aspects embedded in each one of these flows or not? Now, project finance by itself is very cumbersome because it looks at the world in a very discrete kind of way, item by item, and therefore one is not able to ensure that there's harmonization amongst projects that give you national impact. And that is what country platforms are expected to do. So while we're advocating in country platforms not to have a narrow-minded, what I would call conventional paradigmatic view of finance, we're also not advocating then for finance to just flow because somebody has said there will be a climate response impact as a result of this. In South Africa, what does this mean? The difficulty we've had is that the conventional methodology seeks project financing opportunities. We as a country want general finance that we can then put to use in the name of a climate responsive development program. And I think we need to find, in this case, as Steph and Richard have indicated, a discipline, but it's not a whip type of discipline. It's a discipline that comes from practice, from learning and from improving. But very importantly, it's a discipline that comes as a result of mutual trust being built. Now, it's easy to talk about trust. And so if you wanted another aspect of leadership that needs to be thrown into this mix, it is how do you display scientific and artistic qualities as a leader in bringing various strands together. But let me turn to finance now, Kani. In our case, we've got some very, very good examples. So we know that our development as well as climate responsive journey has necessarily in the first 5 to 7 years passed through our energy crisis. And so in our energy crisis, which is mitigating in its essence, we can in fact argue that we need to mobilize finance in a way that meets those objectives, but which is also climate responsive. So by way of example, we have unfortunately interrupted by a particular set of 9 years, developed very, very good market capability as well as risk management capacity for renewable energy projects that the private sector alone can finance. And if needs be, then some of the risks reduced by government. So if a major part of our energy transition is in fact a rollout, a rapid rollout of renewables, then we, I think, have the capability as well as the attractiveness to be able to get the private sector to fund that. What is of constraint is the grid. And therefore, right now, through the Minister of Electricity and Energy, we're looking at how within the existing regulatory framework, we can crowd in private sector investment to strengthen the grid and extend the grid. Because unless we extend the grid to those areas that are endowed with renewable energy sources, those sources can never be brought onto the grid and electrons evacuated to their points of use. And so it's very, very important for us to find a way of doing what government does best, and that is policy regulation and creating the conditions that are conducive for the private sector to come in and invest. And that can happen. However, the challenging parts are in adaptation and resilience, where in the context of scarce fiscal resources, we have to become much, much smarter as to how to put those scarce fiscal public resources to use in a way that I'm not going to use the word blend, Prof. I swear, I'm never going to use the word blend again, to leverage other forms of capital which might be seeking returns, but also might be seeking to do morally the right thing, and put all of these things together so that the fiscus alone doesn't have to bear the cost of a country's adaptation and resilience plan.
Yeah. You know, Deepak, thank you for bringing this climate finance languaging agenda to the point where you're saying it's at the end of the day, it's finance. It's about finance. And then also you talk about how do we use the public resources. When you look at, in fact, when you work across the continent, we have these sessions, we have big minds, we're leading in terms of ensuring that we're coming up with how Africa can stand on its own, develop growth on its own, recover and be restored. But sometimes you wonder, where is this happening when you look at the broader sense of how our society looks today in many of our countries? So I just like that point where you say, at the end of the day, it's about finance. So Dr. Olimide, this is what I just want to ask you. How then do we ensure that country platforms, they don't only focus at those that who already have? It's not about elitism. It's not only about those who, in natural way, whenever there's assistance, the focus is who is this going to serve? How are we going to make sure that this is not detached from the citizen priorities? Those who don't sit at these webinars, those who don't have the voice that some of us have.
Thank you very much, Kanyi. I just want to start by underscoring what Deepak said earlier regarding, climate finance is finance. We were recently trying to get someone to join the team to work on climate finance, and what I was looking for was project finance experience. Because at the end of the day, when you're thinking, to add to what Deepak said, when you're thinking about climate finance, the same reasons that you can't attract the other forms of finance are going to probably be the same reasons that it's hard for you to attract climate finance. So it's absolutely key to just make sure that we don't forget that they're essentially the same. It's finance. To answer your question, yes, first of all, participation. Participation broad-based as much as possible, and I'm really happy that whenever I hear about the transition now, the just element comes up very quickly, because it's about ensuring that those who will be affected by any plan created, those who will be affected by any elements of the plans created, need to be part of the conceptualization of those plans. And that includes the high-level, ministries and departments and agencies that we mentioned earlier, but also CSOs, community organizations, community leaders, think tanks, NGOs, and so on, should be part of the design process that creates what ends up being a country platform. I know that my fellow South African co-panelists here sort of want to downplay the importance of what the PCC and South Africa has done, but I think they do indeed give us an example of what it could look like when you involve a broad-based participatory process, which also includes, of course, the private sector, because these are projects that will be implemented by the private sector at the end of the day. So having them at the table is really important. But yeah, I'm making sure that the CSO trade unions are part of the design of it, and make them formal participants, not just people who are consulted by it, but they're actually really within the process. That's one. Two, I think that very quickly, the wins that reflect the interest of citizens have to be factored in. If you don't have quick wins and people keep hearing about a country platform which may affect their lives, there will be doubts around it. So ensuring that very quick wins that are connected to lives of people is also key here. Identifying very clear key performance indicators, KPIs, right, would be extremely important for a country platform. And these have to go beyond, emissions reduction, but actually include social and economic outcomes. If it's energy focused, we put energy access. If it's water focused, we put access to potable water and so on. That also has to be clear there. Another one is I would say the government should consider having a sort of integrated data management system. which is available to, for people to see. A recent one that was created that I've seen is one that AFDB supported countries to create around NDC implementation, right? So there's an NDC implementation index that clearly shows what elements of countries' nationally determined contributions are actually being achieved, are on track to be achieved. I think something along those lines would help. But the point simply is, citizens have to be empowered to know what is being done in their name and which may affect them into the future. And one clear way of doing this is showing the data to the public so that it's easily accessible and it's easily understandable. I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we have questions. I'm going to give an opportunity for the questions that we have received. And by the way, we've also shared the report, the paper that Stefan has written. So, Dr. Olumide, you talk extensively about relationships, engagement, ensuring that the societies are involved. But there is an elephant, going back to your elephant story, Deepak. We know in the continent and across the globe, by the way, that the C word, corruption, is a big thing that we are faced with. So, Richard, your focus mainly also is around governance and looking at sustainability risk. What do you think would need to be done to circumvent those corruption risks that we are all faced with? And again, I want you to touch more on building the public trust, because like it or not, guys, it is bad out there. So how do we make sure that the country platforms are not going to be seen to be, yes, only for those who can afford, but they are going to serve the needs of the society without anybody getting extra out of it?
So I can see my good friend Olumide smiling. He's probably thinking.
I was gonna wish you good luck in tackling
Yeah,
that.
no, exactly. I can see there's a big bubble out of your head going, "Oh, so glad Richard's got that one." So I'm going to say that there are better people, better qualified people, such as Dr. Abimbola, to answer this. But look, I think again, you've asked a good question. It's not an unfair question. It's just a very difficult one because, of course, we've all been contemplating and struggling for decades to figure out how to tackle what was once in the literature described as the multi-headed dragon of corruption. And there's no easy answer. I think what one has to do with country platforms is invoke that principle of discipline that Steph spoke on earlier. Clearly, if you are trying to persuade people to invest, and the word investment, I think, is critical to this. It's, to my mind, it's essential to the definition of country platforms. They're really country investment platforms, locking investment into a strategic plan that is owned, designed, and delivered by a country. And if one thinks in those terms, clearly, as we all know for finance, you have to be persuasive to the investor. And that includes being able to be convincing about the governance safeguards that are in place. Now, how you organize those governance safeguards is going to, I think, depend perhaps on the particular context. It's going to require some serious hard work. It's going to require transparency of the sort that the Presidential Climate Commission showed during its thinking processes, which allowed people to literally watch and engage with that process. And that breeds trust. For a long time, my career was built on freedom of information and transparency. Has been the bedrock of good governance and accountability. I think that principle holds true. And lastly, we have to be creative in designing new instruments and mechanisms. And some people might have come across the construction sector transparency initiative, COST. It operates in 18 countries around the world, 4 of them in Africa. It's got a superb track record now of saving public money. And it saves public money by disclosing to everybody how projects that are involved or which involve large quantities of public investment in infrastructure projects, how those projects are designed and how they're implemented. It enables people to see what's going on, and a lot of money's been saved. COST has recently, with some help from people like myself and a pilot in South Africa, has extended its transparency index on infrastructure to include climate finance in relation to infrastructure projects. And so there's a bunch of new indicators there. Now, I'm not saying that is the solution. It is one of the kinds of ways in which one can contemplate designing very specific mechanisms and instruments that can support a country platform in ensuring that there is as much confidence, a word that's been used more than once in this webinar so far, that there can be as much confidence in the process as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Richard. I'm just going to go to some of the questions quickly. One question is, are there any other examples in the so-called French-speaking countries other than Senegal on country platforms that are working? Anybody can just share any other examples?
Yes, perhaps I can, because we're tracking which countries are showing an interest, and also which countries are likely to launch platforms at the COP in Brazil. And the African countries that will be launching, as we understand it, include one francophone, include the following: Ghana, Lesotho, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. We know that there is very strong interest amongst some of the francophone countries, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Cote d'Ivoire has been doing very interesting work on debt, and I'd like to come back to that in a minute, if I may. Also, Gabon, until very recently, but because of the political events of the last fortnight, Madagascar was very interested. Mauritania is another country that is reaching out. So quite a lot of interest in the francophone parts of Africa, encouragingly. I just thought that I would also say something about the other question, which talks to another elephant in the room, which is corruption and rent seeking. And I think the figure you give of $10 billion is very, very underestimated. I also have seen figures of illicit financial outflows from Africa of above $80 to $90 billion a year. You know, and if you think that the whole investment package of the JETP in South Africa, Deepak, I think it's $97 billion. We see that flowing out of, and that's a big economy in Africa. We see that flowing out of Africa every year in an illicit way. I think that one of the things that country platforms may do to help this problem is that they spread the accountability across institutions in the economy and in government, and also spread the transparency and accountability between those institutions, banks, domestic actors, and critically key investors. The more we make them transparent, the more they mitigate against the idea of rent seeking. This is not to say that corruption and rent seeking will be, will go away, but I think that it's time that country platforms which have a kind of rule of law element. I mean, if you look at the country platforms we're seeing around the world, they are constituted within the highest levels of government, and they are declared so to the outside world. So I hope that they do something about this. I also wanted to quickly, if I may, can you just say something about types of finance? Because someone raised the issue of the capital stack and blended finance in the questions. For Africa, I think, and Deepak is better at this than I am, so let me just shoot and see if I'm okay on this one. There are going to be 5 kinds of finance that we will need to manage in country platforms. The first is domestic capital. If Ethiopia can build an entire dam, a very large one, I know it's got some controversial elements, through the issuance of domestic public bonds, That's an extraordinary achievement, okay? And it shows how much domestic capital savings can be brought to bear. And Mark Swilling writes this all the time, reminds us that the domestic capital market is a really important one. The second one, of course, is foreign direct investment, the $520 trillion or however much it is. But remember, it comes in dollars and we have to pay it back, a return in dollars. So it's got its difficulties, and as all FDI has. The third is debt. More and more country platforms are starting to look at how we leverage debt capital and remanage debt through, say, for example, debt swaps and so on, into the country platform stack, the stack of money that is being used in the country platform for investment purposes. So the debt management offices of these countries will also have to play a part, as will the fiscal space and ability of the country to leverage investment. That brings us to the fourth one, which is the role of guarantees. We're working at the moment with MIGA at the World Bank to create a general country platform-driven credit guarantee vehicle, a global one. And South Africa is also, and Deepak can speak to that if people are interested, launching its own credit guarantee vehicle. So the role of guarantees in this finance equation are going to be very important. And the last one Dr. Olamide raised is insurance. When it comes to the very vulnerable, high-risk, unpredictable events of climate loss and damage, which can wipe out a third of an economy, as we've seen in smaller states, we need to find ways of insuring against that and spreading the insurance load. And so that is going to require a lot of creative thinking at country platform level. So I thought it would just be useful to debunk this idea of blended finance and say that it's actually different types of finance used in different creative ways that hold the key to this. And I see Deepak's hands up, so I'll hand over to him if that's okay, Kanya.
Thank you. Deepak, I was going to ask you the next question anyway, so please come through, and then I'll ask you the question that I have.
Thank you, Kanya. For a lawyer, I must say that Steph has a really good grasp of what the various elements of a climate stack might look like. But I think he's picked on a very, very important issue, and that is domestic capital and financial markets. Now, not every country is endowed like South Africa is, like Ethiopia has managed to do, like perhaps Rwanda is getting to, and maybe Nigeria and Kenya have a degree of capacity as it relates to domestic capital and financial markets, and others have domestic and capital financial capability as a result of natural endowments. I'm going to come back to that issue because I think it's very, very important, particularly if those endowments are fossil fuel endowments. But in South Africa, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but on Friday, we're launching the 2025 edition of the South African Climate Finance Landscape Mapping Report. That has now, this is the third edition, having started tracking climate finance flows all the way back from 2018-19, and then 2021, and now 22-23 being the output that we will, in fact, launch on Friday. South Africa is very interesting in the sense that 92% of climate finance flows, yes, largely to mitigation, very little but increasing year on year for adaptation and resilience, is from the domestic capital and financial markets. And so 92% of the climate finance that flows, climate finance being defined as finance with a climate component to it, in this case, mitigation. And that's very interesting. And so we're not at the whim, we're not at the mercy and the whim of either donor countries or international finance. And we're lucky in South Africa to be in that position. The challenge in South Africa is a very clear set of signals through the country platform, conversation and mechanism to the domestic private sector in the first instance with respect to what we want. the elements to be financed in order for them collectively to meet the kind of national development agenda, in this case in the energy system, that we require. The other interesting thing, and I'll stop at this level after indicating this detail, the other systemic set of issues, and again, it might not be the case for other countries, for South Africa certainly, is that of that 92% of domestic flows, 86 odd percent is in fact banking finance. So shorter term debt stock from the banks. Now, the critical question is that if we are endowed as we are with a long-term savings as well as asset manager and life industry, why is it not that this short-term debt is not being packaged for passage on to the long-term asset manager and life industry? And I think from South Africa's sort of financial architecture point of view, that is at the heart of what we need to try and achieve. A locational functioning relationship between the various balance sheets that exist in our own domestic capital and savings, as well as banking balance sheets. And then finally, as we know, in some households, there is a capacity to save and invest as well. And we need to harmonize all of this. And the only way we can do it, really, coming back to the question that you asked and Richard answered, we have to build trust and confidence that through this mechanism, we can in fact stem leakage in the form of corruption. We can in fact have a degree of transparency and signaling through the market that makes investors attracted to putting their investments and their capital to work in the direction of what we consider to be the key thrust, in this case of South Africa's just energy transition, which I indicated is part of, but not a total country platform.
Thank you. Thanks, Deepak. With the next 6 minutes that we have in this platform, hopefully, Susan Joronge, also a fellow CISL, and also ambassador for CISL. Susan, based in Kenya, if there's anything, Sisi, that you want to share at this point, this is an opportunity for you just to share from your perspectives some of the experiences, or maybe some of the your own thoughts sitting in Nairobi, Kenya, and driving the leadership and sustainability agenda from that point. Deepak, I want to come back to you, and the panelists also can come into this one, because we have to look at the continental framework. We have to, yes, South Africa, we seem to be on the right track, but continentally, what would be those practical steps? Where do we start as a continent? And then also, how can South Africa's experiences, and I'm sure there's other experiences across the continent, how can those inform our sister brother countries in terms of their first platforms, particularly those who are not even at the bottom of this mountain?
Kanye, I'll try and be very brief, because I think Olumide is probably better placed to answer across the continent set of questions. But I want to say that Steph started off by saying that this continent's total emissions accounts for something like 4% of the global emissions. And therefore, I need to make the moral point that except for South Africa, perhaps, the rest of Africa has not made a contribution to climate change. And therefore, there has to be, in my opinion, a loss and damage dividend that needs to be at the heart of financing each of these countries' development programs. And that is a moral question, but it is one that cannot be avoided. I was recently, well, not so recently, about a year ago in Nigeria, and I engaged with various Nigerian decision makers, both in government and in industry. And what's very interesting, I'll use this as an example. Nigeria has the capacity through its oil revenues to be able to make investments that in effect are domestic investments. However, Nigeria's population does not have access to electricity. So there is this contradiction, this almost paradox, where an oil-rich country, which should be able to produce energy, has not, for whatever set of historical reasons, produced it for the benefit of its own domestic civil society. And the key question then is, as Nigeria sets off on a path to developing livelihoods as well as jobs, as well as industry. Does it utilize its fossil fuel resources and in the process of doing that create massive pollution in the domestic environment which does not exist? Or does it utilize renewable technologies that can leapfrog and negate the need to actually have good old-fashioned long grids of high voltage lines through the country? And I think in the case of Nigeria, this conversation needs to be held. How does it maximize on the domestic endowment that it has for as long as the global market holds up from its oil resources versus what powers through energy the development agenda for a country like Nigeria into the future? These are difficult trade-off decisions, and that they are at the heart of decisions that countries need to be making.
Thank you. At the end of the day, it starts with leadership and it ends with leadership. Richard, I'd like you to come in here in terms of what do we intend to do going forward? What is the leadership dimension as far as country platforms is concerned? Because this is where it's going to make a difference.
Well, as CI South Africa, a central plank of our strategy is to seek innovation broadly in terms of bankable projects and so on, but also in terms of governance mechanisms. So the idea of country platform sits at the heart of that. It's a way, I think, of convincing people that they can seize the opportunity space that an economic transition provides. It helps us to win that argument. But secondly, of course, at the core of this discussion today is how you unlock finance to come to the party to pay for that transition. And the fork in the roads moment that I think Africa faces between the legacy economy, as Professor Lopez puts it, and the new economy is an inflection point. And country platforms have the opportunity to be the governance place where that all of us can choose one pathway rather than the other. That requires leadership because it requires vision, it requires strategy, it will require technical skills. Steph's paper, the one we've commissioned and published today, what it talks about is 3 different types of leadership: the political leadership we've discussed here, the middle to top tier kind of more technocratic and on the public service side of what's required to implement, and then the kind of stakeholder management and engagement leadership that's required for social legitimacy, for bringing people together to get what I have called a whole economy transition. There's key parts to this. The paper includes a 17-point checklist that Steph has developed in consultation with, I know, many people. It's an emerging discipline, this, and we're all learning together. I think it's very exciting. We're going to have to work fast. The challenge is urgent, but there's an opportunity space now. So what I hope we will do, to finally answer your question, is that we will convene leaders to build that community of practice in Africa. We will work with partners such as APRI and others who are working in this space to customize the kind of leadership programs and support and coaching that's going to be required so that we can get that discipline, convince investors, and make country platforms deliver the promise that they hold.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Dr. Olamide Ambibola. Thank you, Mr. Deepak Patel. And thank you, Steph. Thanks to the Conversation Africa as our host. And I'm going to hand back to you as it is now a wrap. But thank you so much for this informative session. Thank you. Candice?
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you so much, Kanye. We're just about to end off. I'm going to hand over very briefly to our West Africa editor, Adejwan Shoyinka, just to do a quick formal thank you, but such a great conversation. I really loved it. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Adejwan, over to you.
Right. I mean, I really enjoyed myself listening to this conversation, and it's been very, 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 very good, very, very good one. And my task is very simple, it's just to say thank you and run off, and I think the moderator has actually done a good job of that as well, thanking the panelists and thanking everyone that's been involved. But I must say a huge, huge, huge thank you to you, for a very effective moderation of this panel discussion. And also a huge thank you to our panelists, and in no particular order, Dr. Olumide Abimbola, Deepak Patel, Professor Richard Calland, and Steph Robinhammer. Thank you very much for your time, for your expertise, for your knowledge, for breaking down what I previously thought was a very complex topic. Looking at country platform, but you really broke it down for us, and huge thank you for that. Also, without our attendees, we'll be talking to ourselves actually. So, mostly a huge thank you to people who joined us from the beginning of this session and stayed to the end of the session. It's been a very good time of learning and also of interacting and also asking questions and getting to know better about country platform and about what is required of us, as different countries, and also in terms of how to get sustainable funding across the continent. I must say a huge thank you to our partners in bringing this together, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and a particular, thank you to Professor Richard Calland, whose idea it was, to bring all of this together. And we practically, worked to bring everybody together on this platform to get today. Huge thank you to you, Prof. And also, I must also quickly say that, we call the Conversation Africa for a reason. For us, the conversation doesn't end there. It continues even after this panel discussion, continues on our YouTube platform, where this entire session would sit, and where our audiences can still continue to interact with the body of knowledge that has been shared here today. It will also potentially continue as an article on the Conversation Africa platform, where we might be able to curate some of the key points that we've learned here today and bring them together in an article format. So that's how we will intend to extend the conversation beyond the few minutes that we've spent on this platform today. Thank you very much for your time, everyone, and thank you for a very wonderful session.